Bom dia, once again, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very sorry to interrupt the buzz and chatter. It's always great to hear, but we'd like to get our second session here going, and we'll leave plenty of time, I promise, for more discussion and networking as the day goes on. Hope you all had a good coffee, a little bit more time to wake up and move into the next part of our conference program this morning. Our second session, which we've headlined Lessons Learned and New Strategies. I think it's not a surprise, it goes in line with the overall theme, and we're going to build upon some of the stuff that we heard already in session one in terms of how the industry has been reacting to the crisis here in Brazil, and perhaps most importantly, what we've learned to make us stronger for the future. On this panel, we're going to have presentations from major manufacturers, from Continental, a major tier supplier, from logistics providers, and we also from Jeffco, and we also have from EY, key supply chain sort of analysts and research who will be able to give us some insight on some of the trends and developments we're seeing, particularly on the technology side. Some of the topics that I anticipate discussing, especially when we talk about lessons learned, it was also something that Paulo raised in the first sessions. We talk about partnerships and sort of short-term versus long-term thinking. This is something that I think not just the Brazilian automotive logistics industry can struggle with. I think that's a global phenomenon, but I think we can also talk about some ideas of how the sector can work together a bit more closely. And it came up quite a lot in the first session. I think almost all of our panelists brought up something about the technological changes we're seeing across the automotive industry, but actually really across so many parts of our economies and societies, whether that's through connectivity or automation, e-commerce, and the ways that this is all starting to reshape the supply chain. And now when we talk more about logistics and supply chain digitalization, obviously there's a whole trove of new tools and processes and ideas which we're starting to see. Newton from GM obviously gave a good presentation on a sort of global transformation that we're seeing at the car maker. And of course we're seeing many ideas getting floated across the sector, whether it's using drones in delivery or perhaps for inventory counting, the potential for 3D printing, the benefits of cloud computing, big data, predictive analytics. Yeah, I can name the buzzwords one after another, but I think the key thing is that these are not just buzzwords really. There are many use cases we're starting to see, and again, many areas that these new technologies can really make a difference in the automotive logistics supply chain, including here in Brazil. So again, looking forward to hearing more from our experts on that. Let me introduce our panelists to you. Again, we'll have 3 speakers and we'll have 3 presentations and some time for Q&A at the end. First, we're very pleased to welcome, for the first time to our conference here, Marcio Machado, who's the head of Plant Supply Chain Management for Continental, for CEP, that's Central Electronics Plant here in Brazil. Will give us a look at some of the operations for Continental, but also more broadly across Tier 1 supplier and logistics. Also very pleased to welcome Marcelo Antonianizzi, partner at EY Advisory Services, Supply Chain and Operations for the global consultancy firm Ernst & Young. Again, able to give us some insights into some of the latest technological developments in the supply chain. And last but not least, we'll hear from Alex Fagiolo, Director of Sales and Marketing for Jeffco, which is of course an important global automotive logistics provider, but with significant operations here in South America. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the podium on to Marcio, and we'll get started. So Marcio, stage is yours. Thank you.
Is the pointer?
It's right on.
Bom dia.
Good morning. After coffee, we have a little bit more energy. Come on, good morning. So it's a pleasure to be here for the first time. I have been in the supply chain and engineering business for 20 years, but this is my second year in the automotive industry. I worked for Nokia, Microsoft, and it's a pleasure to be here to share with you. Like Chris said, I'm in the electronics division of Continental, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about Continental and then on the lessons learned, if we have learned any lessons at all. So we have many learned lessons, but we have many to learn yet because I have come from other sector, and this is a very dynamic sector, and there's a lot to learn. Well, a little bit about Continental. Continental Group is a German multinational company. Some facts: it has more than 145 years working in innovation and progress, especially in the automotive segment. The billing last year was for over 40 billion euros. The company is still growing, which is very good. Four mega trends of the company: safety, information, environment, and mobility. The four main values: trust, passion for winning, freedom to act, and one for the others. These are very nice values that make us inside the company to have excellent relations. There's great pressure and dynamic relations with the tier one suppliers, and as I can see, it's the most challenging one. So it's a good combination of factors that bring b- make the business more challenging. This is a very nice value of the company, and over 220,000 employees globally and 427 locations in 56 countries with focus on sustainability. I also put on the future in motion of Continental those four bullet points. They are in line with the OEMs. It's very much like what Newton talked about in his presentation: connectivity, the sharing, and automation and electrification that we see as one of the future factors, and we are investing a lot in this sector in line with the OEMs. Talk a little bit about Brazil and South America. We have 11 plants only in Brazil, also service and offices. I work in Guarulhos unit. It is the only unit that's central. It's called CEP, Central Electronic Unit Plant, and it's one of the most complex and largest in the region. I'm going to show you the products that we manufacture so that we have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about electronics. In the automotive industry, this is changing quite a bit, and there's a lot of growth in it. And our plants, we are in GM in Gravataí, also in Resende, and we have also some units in Camaçari, where we have the tires business. It's well known. Uh, when I say work in Continental, people think about the white line, and then they think about tires, but we have several other products. These are five divisions of Continental, and they are present in Brazil, all of them. We have the interior, the electronics involved with this uh, division here, tires, powertrain, and Montitech, which is a line that's less automotive. So it has several segments in Quantitech. These are the five main continental divisions, and we are present in Brazil in all five of them. So, talking a little bit about what we understand as lessons learned. To understand that, I'll give you a view of the main challenges of our challenges that we had and that we still have. And with the crisis, we saw, like most of you, a drop in volumes, an increase in logistics. At Continental, we have several units that are decentralized, so we have a lot of different suppliers. We had an identified opportunity for new logistics partners, both in logistics and also in imports and exports. Organization is non-standard difference of processes between amongst plants, the demand and planning process,
Inventários mais altos e baixo.
excess capacity, large inventories, and these are the main characteristics and main challenges, and also that we see as opportunities. Then, talking about lessons learned about scenario, we identified that in the main lessons learned, the companies saw the need for focusing and integrating. So in this period, we created a position, for example, Roberta, who is here with us, she took this job. We were looking at all the integration and the international freights, both sea freight and aerial freight, the brokerage part in the imports and exports, tariff classification.
Uma área, um segmento para ganhar sinergia.
We created an area in this segment to create synergies and have positive results when we do an integration among several units. These are the roles that have been working fine and generating re positive results, and that we understand that we should continue with this integration factor.
Here we have some practical examples of what these years have brought in terms of improvement. I call them value innovation because the main thing we talked about innovation in the previous panel, creativity, and as I said, in a very high complex as ours, you must be very creative and innovate. So the blue ocean strategy, as you may know, only looking at costs is not enough. So you must also look at how to reduce costs and add value to customer. And some may say, but that's impossible. If you reduce costs, you lose in terms of service level that impacts to the customer. But that's where creativity comes in. So we have always looked into those projects from this point of view that I must reduce costs but be innovative at the same time. And we compete with other plants. So Mexico, for example, is a main competitor in some segments because they have better costs. So balancing this out and having creativity in such an environment is a challenge. So several actions were taken in Brazil. For example, for standardization of supply chain, we've defined key areas, focus, keeping people motivated, and something that's probably well known by many of you, that the world is becoming more digital and electronic. Automotive industry is just one example, but if we think of IoT, for example, big data analysis, everything we're talking about the future, as I'll address at the end of the talk of 4.0 industry, everything is becoming more digital and using more electronics. So a very complex scenario for us as suppliers in the automotive industry because we are small in this world of electronics, but it's growing the use of electronics worldwide, not only in Brazil. So now I'm starting to have restrictions on electronic supply. For example, when there's an earthquake in Japan, I've we're having lack of capacitors and resistors because there was an expected production. We've purchased a certain amount of items, and when the now that the supplies, now that sales are increasing, we've bought the entire capacity of our supplier, and supplier no longer can increase production. So one of the messages that I would like to give to this group is that we must work closer to our partners, looking forward. The longer we can forward uh, precise volumes of growth, the better, because we will be able to buy the full capacity of a supplier and won't have problems of supply. Now we are just planning too little, into the future. When then we have to go to the second tier, third tier suppliers. They say they have an issue with supplying more, and then that causes an impact on the entire chain. So whenever a situation is very critical and it affects other plant, we have a global manager for allocation. It aligns world demand and starts making the distribution of components, managing the critical areas. There's a lot of interaction between the plants. We help each other. We in Brazil help other plants sending components. The situation is so critical that we also help other plants so that our customers abroad may be served and not be negatively impacted by the lack of electronic supplies. We we have a volume review process, SNOP, together with sales and the business unit. What is the projected volume we see by customer, by segment, by product profile? And this planning allows us to send a more correct volume forecast for the entire supply chain, which increases our chances of success. And also material planning. We make a closer integration with our customers. I know that OEM companies don't have time to talk to all suppliers because there are so many, but having a collaborative planning in a more longer term is very important. So this connection in terms of planning increases the chance of success. So I'm talking about integration of all planning areas, integrated planning. For example, materials planning. We've implemented the use of in-house tools focused on reducing obsolete materials or slow-moving materials, for example. Roberta, for example, she's in charge of integration to improve inbound logistics, foreign trade. We've changed suppliers, looked for partners, were able to reduce costs and improving service levels. And I agree with what was said in the morning that keeping these partnerships in the future is very important. Now that when we choose new partners, we don't only look at costs, we look at the level of service as well. We continue to conduct hub consolidation and shipment, trying to reduce warehousing. Something that affects us in Brazil is, for example, the strike of the revenue service that is a never-ending issue. We always think it's over, and then there's a message that they're still on strike. The OEA level 1, the blue line, that's very important. And in terms of warehousing, domestic freight, we did an in-source with our main warehousing in Guarulhos and packaging washing, which highly improved quality and cost. So with creativity, it's possible to improve quality and reduce costs in a positive way. My last slide is looking forward. I talked about OEA, or AEO, rather, level 2, global electronics industry supply constraints, midterm demand, deeper collaborative planning with customers. Many Continental as well as other companies are investing a lot. There will be a time when our ideas for innovation will, end. So it's very important. It's Industry 4.0 towards the future. We're investing heavily in that. I'm doing a research in this. What what of these solutions we could bring to Brazil in the short run or middle term. All of them are being developed in Germany, some involving customers or suppliers. But these are the main advantages that 4.0 industry can bring to us in talking about quality, cost, and competitiveness. The whole world is looking at this. If Brazil doesn't look at that, we'll be even further behind. Um, in Germany, many of these things are implemented already or being implemented. These are things that Continental is investing to bring to Brazil shortly. I'm talking about advanced robotics, the cobots, as well as AGVs. It's autonomous transportation for logistics movements inside a plant, for example. That's advanced logistics and robotics tools. Enhanced transport management. Today, when we work at LPs, or freight service providers, we use email, telephone, and a lot of manual transactions. In transport management, they're web-based solutions, automated, less dependent on human action, that can be used to improve the process and make it more independent. Automated replenishment, geolocation, geofencing, autonomous supply network planning. There's a lot of people involved in planning, and the more big data, the more sensors and connected, and the more interaction between customers and suppliers, the more automated it could be. Supply network risk management. Warehousing also tends to be more vertical, integrated, automatic. And we're also investing on what key wearable devices can be used in logistics. Maybe a watch or goggles or something 3D. All this is being studied, and these are solutions that are being brought to Brazil that can be developed here. And this is how Continental looks forward into technology. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Mazzio, very interesting. I think it was a short presentation, but so much packed in there in terms of global supply chain developments. When we look at the importance of an electronic supply site, and given the levels of electronic components in vehicles, and the sort of high-tech supply chain, and some of the aspects that obviously are involved in that, complicated, like Japanese supply and how that can be disrupted globally, demand outstripping supply, excuse me. And of course, building into the Industry 4.0 sort of concepts and terms, something is spoken about pretty much universally in Germany and in Europe and other locations. As Marcio put it quite bluntly, if Brazil doesn't look to this, it will fall behind. And so I think these are not just buzzwords, as I sort of said in my own intro. I think these are real things coming down in the supply chain, and it's important that we share the use studies and case studies and where they're working already. That leads us on nicely to our next presentation, Marcelo Antonionazzi from EY, who will give us some more insight into technology.
Hello, my name is Marcelo Antoniazzi. The idea, since this is a automotive and logistics forum, we're going to talk about asset management. So we'll address Industry 4.0, how technology is linked with that. And some of our customers asked us about assets. So when I say assets, I mean both trucks, equipment, and in the automotive industry, tooling as well. So questions were made. Now we are just EY. It used to be Ernst& Young, now EY. So we have these areas very separate in the company. We have the auditors, risk auditing. We have the team of tax, taxes and duties. Then the supply chain area, which I work in, looks at the logistics network. How can I optimize assets, increase productivity? There's the team of technology as well. So looking inside EY, we see a mirror what happens in companies. Generally speaking, companies are very similar to what Ernst had, which was to look at assets in a very decentralized way and all separated into departments. When you were talking about proprietary assets, there was one policy. Third-party assets, there was different. Leased assets, it was different. So in general, there were several departments working on this topic: supplies, logistics, operations, the financial area, accounting. What we realized in our diagnosis is that we needed to think about that in a more integrated manner. So I'm going to talk about a methodology related to a more integrated management of assets and integrated with technology as well. Then we'll have the Q&A session later. The main thing is how to work in an integrated manner to optimize asset management. So typically speaking, companies face this challenge of how to manage their assets. For example, for any OEM company today, uh, you have thousands of tools allocated in your suppliers owned by the OEM company. So the OEM owns the tool, but it leases the tool to a third party. And the main issue in terms of accounting is how to control that tool, whether it's producing properly, where it's being maintained, if I can account for it or book it properly. Another point is how can I reformulate the entire process. So I'll show you how we try to optimize management of these tools. We try to work since I start looking at the need up until the time when you have to get rid of an asset. So it goes to storage, usage, maintenance. So always operation and maintenance is included. How can I use it in the best way possible for it to reach its maximum production? But it goes through also the strategy for purchase of tools and assets, and now the commissioning until it's time to discard or to write it off. So with 4.0 and ITO, there are several tools and technology accelerators that can improve the process highly. So there are three main views. The accounting point of view, how can I have this depreciation flow for the asset? How can I work with the residual value? I was talking with some friends during the break. For example, if you have a project, OEM or assembly, a logistics company will participate in a bid for an OEM. And one of the main factors is how you're going to depreciate your assets. How is the flow of that assets in that agreement? It's very difficult to work in the financial and accounting terms in a project like that. And the same applies to the development of a new vehicle. So the tools have a flow of depreciation, a depreciation schedule, and sometimes this is faster than what you estimated, and that generates a major gap. So, so the residual value of the asset is important, the depreciation schedule, accounting aspects. Then comes the acquisition. So what's the best form? For example, whether you should lease the tool or purchase the tool. This is important, having an operating lease. There are financial and accounting aspects that you should take into account when acquiring an asset. And the last point, I think it's more clear for everyone, are the operational aspects. What are the maintenance costs, operating costs, the productivity of the asset? How can I compare assets? And the TCO, the total cost of ownership, which is to assess the value of your tool throughout this entire process. So what's the best form of acquisition and financing, and how to control them in an integrated and unified way? In general, all the companies I visit and the companies I visited don't have an unified um, process of asset management. When I talk about fixed assets or property, plant, and equipment, there's one thing. Assets linked to production, it's different. So they have different ways of controlling such assets. And the TCO. So our approach works with four main pillars: increase in productivity of assets, increase of availability of assets, greater visibility of information. It's very common for companies to manage their assets in the operational terms very well, but not pay so much attention in the accounting aspects. And the fourth point is the reduction of financial costs. And then we have the technology enablers. So these are technology tools that can be used in the intelligent asset management. It has three pillars. The first one is the intelligent asset maintenance. Today we have technology available that whenever an asset shows some inconsistency or error, through IoT you enable a request for maintenance or a service order. So we're working on how to make this process available. Also, there are intelligent services on assets, so you have combined assets working together. We conducted a very interesting project in the steel industry in the outbound area, and that awarded us the Smart Label Machine to Machine Award, International Award. These two machines with a certain material that work at 300 degrees centigrade, I was able to connect machine to machine my WMS slash my forklift at the end, for example, was able to find out what pile that steel was located, because they had a hard time locating that sheet that was going to production. So I can identify, do the picking and distribution of the product in a more productive and automated way. There are several advantages to it. For example, increase in productivity, and also second one, very important, it was a very unhealthy environment because it was very hot steel coming out of the plant, and there was a high risk of accident. So when you reduce the number of people working in the area, it's a major gain, and also reducing the error in product delivery. This was a case that was presented internationally, and we won this award because it was a very complex environment, very hot and metallic. So we were able to find a solution despite all those constraints. This is an example of how you can work on IoT and Industry 4.0 to give higher productivity to your assets. And then talking about the tools, you can have the RFIDs or smart sensors working in an integrated manner to control your assets that's located at third parties. In addition, there are several items that can be used. For example, 3D printing to give you specific MROs with a very quick replacement speed, up to drones. We use drones, for example, at EY to make inspections in more remote locations. We use a software with a drone to make this type of checking. RPA, I don't know if you all know that. RPA is related to the simulation of a human action using software. Robot process automation, because you render the process that would be done by a human being in an automated way. So data entry, for example, in the financial and operational area, for example, invoicing, payment of taxes. These are all cases in which we could make use of these technologies to help in asset management. And also UI inspection tool, which is a pilot that we use in the Olympic Games.
where we verified all those Olympic centers where you had to check each apartment and in a remote manner through a smartphone, simple smartphone. You had a checklist. You would have a checklist of certain assets at that location, and with the GPS you would put it on in the cloud, and you would see the pending matters. Now, bringing it to our life, imagine you with assets all over Brazil, and certain client comes to you and says, I have a problem because I have 7 different locations that I work with, and how can we control it? So we brought this solution, which is a solution to look at those assets as a whole. And here we show how we typically work on that. We work on an analysis approach to see what niches you have in your management of assets. How do I integrate this chain? And then I also identify the best technologies associated to this. In this case, I brought this an example. This is my last slide. Mm, what do I address? What are the niches? What are the problems that I address with this? And then I brought you a tool example. It's from divergences in the number of parts planned and those produced. So I can bring through this technology, I can guarantee that. I can guarantee that your process of changes in specs is more adequate and more controlled, so you are able to control your accounting part and the construction of tools, payment. So we're looking at the acquisition part and the payment of tools, and then you can also look at the control of those assets, whether those assets were outsourced. So I'm looking at the accounting side of the process and the logistics of the process That is, I mix both the operational and the accounting part of the asset. And obviously, what we work very strongly on is if we have any control deficiencies or obsolescence, this tool is actually giving us what we wanted, or is it being operated the way we wanted it to? And so I discontinued this. If I discontinue this tool, how do I write it off? How do I throw it away? So this is an example, and a message to you is this through this very quick example of the flow of the useful life of a tool. This is good for any type of assets, for large size equipment. You can actually see your flow as a whole. The idea is to bring this integrated view of the chain and the technological view associated to it. I'm run out of time. Here you have my contact on the screen. I'm going to be here all day long, so if you want to talk further about this, I'm at your disposal. Thank you.
I
Obrigada.
think a very comprehensive presentation there on asset management, and I think an important subject really when we're talking about the kind of investments in, as Marcelo said, both in tooling and also different technology that we talk about when we're talking about Industry 4.0 or moving to the Internet of Things. So how do we sort of account for these investments and manage this in a sustainable way? And obviously touched upon some quite interesting projects there as well, both in and outside of automotive, which I thought was smart labeling and the inspection tool as well. So thank you for sharing that with us. I thought it was very interesting. Now, our last presentation before we move on to some Q&A, Alex Fagiolo from Jeffco. Thank you for your seat.
Bom dia a todos. Queria começar agradecendo a organização do
I'd like to thank the organization of Automotive Logistics for the invitation to be able to share with you. I didn't prepare anything to introduce Jeffco, but for those who don't know, we are a global logistics operator. We are present in the whole world where there are industrial activities. We were born in 1949 inside the automotive industry, and we are able to render all types of services. We have 12,000 collaborators in different nationalities spread all around the world, and we have 4.3 billion in billing globally speaking. So, talking to Marcelo about the challenge to bring a new theme to this level of audience in this event in 15 minutes to manage to share with you something that's relevant. It's always a challenge. So thinking about that, thinking about my challenge, I'm gonna pass on to you some of that challenge, trying to see what's the level of familiarity that we have, us as an audience, as a group, of some Brazilian indicators. I'm not gonna go into the details of these indicators. My colleagues have showed you more careful figures and breakdowns. We have five charts. Everybody has pen and paper. If you want to test anything about the Brazilian economic indicators, this is the first one. The other challenge that we all have is every time we try to find statistics in Brazil, it's like going to the gym. You have to level things up, and it's always difficult. My main purpose was to get the same time frame for all indicators. It was all so complex that I gave up. So I'm bringing different times of different indicators. So this is number one. This is the second one, the second indicator. This is years are different, as you may say. This is the third. I believe that to many of you, this is part of your daily routine, so it can't be too difficult a task. This is the fourth.
e esse é o quinto.
And this is the fifth and last one. I'm not going to ask everyone, but let's talk a little bit about that. The first indicator that I brought for you is the IPCA, annual IPCA of Brazil. It's the price index. In 93, we were talking about 2,500% inflation. And as of 95, we had a normalization with the real plan, and looking at it closely, which what looks so stable is not that stable. So we have things that go from the order of 22. Now we have a sub-control and the work that was done to contain inflation. We're talking about reasonable figures compared to others around the world. The second chart is Selic, which is also has very crazy kind of behavior. We're talking about 45%. Now we're talking about more reasonable figures of the order of 10%, but it has all this variation that you may see on the screen. The third one is the dollar. This one impacts everyone, both professionally and business-wise. So it started with Plano Real, which was 1 to 1, which was artificially maintained, and now we are at the level of 320, 330. And then again, I draw your attention to the shape of that curve. The fourth one is the price of diesel, which is inherent to our day to day. Our behavior is not so erratic. We left the house of 75 cents. We're talking about 3 reals a liter. And with this variation that Petrobras has been bringing to diesel recently, and lets the price float at the market level. And the fifth, which is very stable, it's not Brazilian, it's the American IPCA. It's something more compatible when we're talking about interest rates. What I wanted to share with you, we talked a little bit about complexity of our industry, the automotive industry. Newton showed us some figures as to number of items, number of suppliers, which gives us an idea of how complex this chain where we perform is. So we all live this every day, and it's very difficult to work in an environment such as that. When we talk about automotive industry and this type of things that we're talking about, the longer the term, it would be idea of the plan in the long term. But this is very difficult. How can I plan 10 years of a plant with this type of environment? It's very difficult. So I put Selic and dollar together in the same chart to try to understand the variations, and I place some macroeconomic um, pillars. It looks a little bit more controlled. You can actually understand the behavior of these variables. But as I said, this complexity is brought to our day to day, and it's very difficult to anticipate how this is going to progress. Now we have a very unstable political scenario, and these curves are bound to perform and to behave erratically again. It's very difficult, really. And what's the message as regards Brazil when we're talking about business environment. It's extremely unstable. We were talking about how can I do to have a little bit more predictability. The more we can share this with our suppliers and our clients, the better will be my stability in my business. From our standpoint, looking at these indicators, instability is the key word for Brazil. We, who are many of us multinational employees, it's very hard for us to explain that to our co-workers, because it's very difficult to tell them how it is to work in an unstable environment such as ours. So much so that Brazilians are kind of insensitive to numbers. Like 8% almost stable. When we're talking about 30% variations up and down, 12 2000% in the case of some indicators. And from my standpoint, it brings an additional challenge when we're talking about cost reduction and improvement of processes. When we talk about 5 and 6%, it sounds little to us, but in the long term, it can make a lot of difference into our business. I understand that this lack of sensitivity to numbers, it's already embedded in our culture. Another thing that ends up happening, we also talked about this earlier on, many companies have disappeared over the last few years. So the expectation of a market that would explode and arrive at 5 million units, with the numbers that came, people disappeared. And in this instinct of survival brings us also to all the industries, to all the executives, a need to take advantage of the opportunities that come up. This creates opportunistic relations. Many times we are positioning ourselves like this with our suppliers. I can give you this now because I don't know what's happening in the future. And this ends up by extending to the whole chain. It's very difficult when we are talking about an industry that needs long term to be able to plan.
A gente discute
And another point, we also discussed this a lot. I was talking to Paulo Sarki. 2 years ago, we talked about that, the issue of the bids being the most usual model to especially for the logistics operators. And we see that a movement in the direction of improving these tools, because for the industry this is a huge effort. You work, a lot of people dedicated to this. You write the tax books and you analyze them. There are some positive points and others are not so positive. So the negative effects, I'm not going to go into details. I'm not an expert in the subject. I'm going to share our view as a participant of this project, as a service renderer. It's within the compliance rules of the companies, gives access to all players uh, who are participating.
The second point is always being in contact with the market checking, high frequency, because we in Brazil have a very real-time visibility in the market, and at all times we are going to the market for bids. So this is positive. But what I call side effects, this brings a short-term focus to the entire chain. Because I know I'm starting a business that will last for 3 or 4 years at the most, I'll try to make the most out of it during this period, and balancing it with the demand from customers to make it efficient during its for its duration. And high implementation costs on both sides. When we talk about the industry, especially OEMs and Tier 1 players, the risks of implementation and controlling these risks imply very high costs. What is the impact of 3 or 4 times having a shutdown of the line and new implementation costs? So these are very high costs for the entire process. And uncertainties are all pricified. We put a price on that. So I know it's a short-term view. I know people will not be open to discuss any changes that may happen during the contract. So everybody includes all the uncertainties in the costs, which may lead to non-existing costs or costs that are priced at lower amounts sometimes. And we have a difficult time implementing structuring projects in a partnership environment. We're looking at all the changes that the industry will go through, and very few people could predict where this will lead us. We have indicators and trends, but saying exactly what this industry will look like in 10 years from now is something that very few people would risk to do. And considering this environment, I believe we should be responsive, resilient, to stay alive as companies and work in partnerships, because this allows me to work in a way that I can know my customer better so that we can work hand in hand towards the solution that we both need. And a question I leave to all of you, and the answer would be different for each one, is that would it be possible to implement a real partnership model involving industry and PSL without the uncertainties being priced, so that we can overcome those indicators that we cannot control, such as interest rate and all those indicators that I talked about in the beginning of my presentation, that I cannot control. But those who are sitting next to me, my suppliers, those who will be with me in that project that is essential for my business in years to come, those people I can choose. And fortunately, we see some initiatives in that direction in Brazil. Bids is still the prevailing model, but there are some industries and companies that are thinking differently. In our point of view, this is the right time to discuss this new approach. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you again to Alex, and indeed to all of our presenters again for the fascinating presentations there, and Alex for giving us some charts to show the stable instability of Brazil, perhaps we can put it that way, some of the challenges that you all deal with on a daily basis, almost to the point of normalization. So there's probably some strengths that come with that for sure, but obviously these sort of short-term side effects as well, as Alex termed them, I think it's interesting and relevant to highlight this and talk together about how we can perhaps look beyond this sort of short-term sort of view. So again, thank you for that. Thanks again to our other panelists as well. I think that was a great insight and mix of some of the lessons learned, and as Macio put at the beginning, the lessons we probably haven't learned yet, if we've learned any quite at all. Before we have lunch, and I'm sure you're all getting hungry, and you know, you're probably going to be tired and not want to do much more, but I do want to give you some opportunities to ask some questions of our panelists if you have any. Same procedure as I said in the first session. Great, I think we have one over there too, so if you can just say your name and company, and we have translation as well.
Na Meritor, sou Tiro Ano, assim como vocês a Continental. Márcia, uma pergunta para você. Você falou da melhoria.
You in Continental, you asked a question about the SOP improvement. I would like to know a bit further about that. If you invested in some system like demand, what is the SOP review that you talked about? Thank you.
Estão ouvindo? O modelo chamado, nós chamamos de Volume Review.
The volume review planning is a review that's done on a monthly basis, And when I say us, is that inside the business units we have, there's one person involved in planning. And the role of this person is to add, along with people from sales, supply chain, and the representative of the business unit, to gather the most relevant information with the customer inputs that comes from logistics and supply chain and discuss it product by product. That's done once a month. Also, there's a system that in which part of the Industry 4.0 we're remodeling system, but that generates changes that we input in the systems. But the main idea of this model is to have a shared decision, a collaborative decision. So it's not just looking at information, but discussing whether that information makes sense or not. For example, I see a trend of drop in a product for a customer, and during the discussion, someone says, well, that doesn't make sense, or it doesn't make sense because the plant from this customer will be they will be on vacation, or there's a phasing out of a product, but this is temporary, for example. And it's a very interactive discussion, and based on that we generate a data that is input into the system of Continental. But we have a shared model of sales and operation planning at Continental. Ok? Temos mais.
The mic coming behind you.
Meu nome é Mar.
My name is Márcio Alexandre. I'm a supply chain manager of after sales at Nissan. It's not a question properly, but more of a comment to see what you think about it. At Nissan, at supply chain after sales, we are conducting this information process that's very much in line with the statement of GM CEO saying that in the next 5 years we'll have transformation that is equivalent to the last 50 years and 4.0 industry. But when I look more specifically after sales area, and we've attended workshops and conferences, etc., I don't see much practical action. What will actually happen? I have ideas talking about automation, drones, but actual implementations or even some guidelines of what will happen in the next 2 or 3 years I don't see that. And when I see the automotive industry growing not so much, and we see companies talking about technology and innovation, but in terms of warehousing, this doesn't seem to apply so much. How do you see that? Let me give you an example of something of this 4.0 industry. FID, somewhat more day-to-day or usual in this market, but there is a topic that to me, like 6 months ago, I didn't even know it existed, which is blockchain. So for example, we did a project in Italy, blockchain, in a winery. It has nothing to do with the automotive industry, but their goal was they had a problem with counterfeit items. So after sales may come in handy there. How did they try to solve this? They created a blockchain platform. For those who don't know, blockchain is a platform that tries to ensure transactions that happen in the supply chain or logistics chain. And the end user, the end consumer, through a query code that is on the bottle, can learn about the entire origin of that wine, where it was grown, and the region that the grape was planted, how it was harvested, the mix of grapes, and the entire fermentation process, distribution, and the sale of the product. So with that, they were able to understand consumption habits. They were able to ensure to users that it was an original product, and also building loyalty, customer loyalty. And as an industry, they were able to learn about the entire flow and how their wines are being distributed and consumed. So thinking about after sales, this could be a very disruptive project to understand how counterfeit parts happen, or how who is purchasing there, being closer to customer. It's kind of a weird idea that comes from a different industry, but it could apply to yours. It's interesting when we talk about collaborative logistics, and we talk about warehouse management using drones for cyclical inventory count, automation and all. But when you look into that more specifically, that's very towards the future, visionary, not so applicable. I think Continental talked about that, if you would like to comment. I think your question is quite relevant. I'm now finishing a master's degree course at GV on supply chain, and we're discussing what industry 4.0 industry applied to logistics can be used in Brazil in the next 3 years in the short term. I haven't finished yet this project, but the 3 points we have identified, uh, also before that a comment, it's not a reality still in Brazil, but in Germany I saw a plant that it's our pilot plant in Johannesburg that everything is monitored and automatically. It's a very high warehouse with 3 lifts and very vertical. The whole process is automated, even feeding product parts into the line. And now the movers, the transportation robots. But the 3 main opportunities I see in the short run from Brazil are: first, collaborative AGVs and cobots. For example, in Brazil, we do have cobots implemented, and next year we'll purchase these movement or transportation robots for a pilot project in our production line, replacing from warehouse to production line or from production line into an intermediary stock area. Also, another area is transport management. We are in contact with our partners, LLC, to see what they have available. But Continental is developing a platform in which it integrates online TGI with using analytics, big data analytics, linking suppliers to customers. Right now we're more focused on suppliers, both from material suppliers and logistics and services suppliers. This has been implemented in Europe. Next year will be US and Asia, and then this will happen in 2019. So fewer emails, fewer phone calls, more automated system. Someone telling you, the system telling you that someone has ended an action, and this goes directly to logistics providers. And the third action would be auto replenishment. And then your question applies, because Industry 4.0, it needs CPS or cyber physical systems to be implemented in equipment. So the machines must be aligned with that. So the integration between machines and system cannot happen if the machines are not at the Industry 4.0 level. But we have a project in auto replenishment, and within 2 years this will happen. So the assembly machine will tell me that in a few hours it will need replenishment from a certain component. That will go directly to warehouse, and there may be some people there, but they will place it in the conveyor that will come to the line. So the material replenishment will be available shortly. Out of those I listed, the first 3, they were listed in the order in which they will be more readily available for Brazil. But I believe those are the solutions. Looking at my context of supplier, tier 1, of course, but there are other contexts of supply chain that are not being addressed. But I've focused on my specific business need. Okay?
Alex, maybe from a logistics provider perspective for Jeffco, both here in Brazil and perhaps also in a global context, what do you see your company perhaps implementing first, most practically from some of these sort of connected Industry 4.0 concepts?
Bom, nós estamos investindo.
We are investing heavily in studies, but as you said, Marshall, many of these things are still quite recent, innovative, and most of them cannot be implemented on an industrial scale. But the speed at which things are happening now, all of us must be very pay close attention to that, because if you're not connected to these technologies, if you're not aware of them, it's likely that we'll miss the opportunity. You know, the timing is important because you cannot start too late. We have 3D printing in Europe, for example. In collaborative logistics for us is something that are many initiatives to bring competitiveness in terms of costs and productivity. And a variable that we consider essential is information, especially for replacement parts. The cost of not having a part available for your dealer will be much higher and higher. So we'll have more preventive maintenance in the future, and the cost of a vehicle that's not operating is will be higher. So the car will become an asset. So a car that's not in operation, it's like a cargo vehicle that's not in operation. So the availability of spare parts and is will become ever more important. Milton from GM. Congratulations on the 3 presentations. My question is for Alex. You've mentioned some options not to use the bid process to choose partners or suppliers. Could you elaborate on that? Thank you for the question, Milton. The bid process may be the starting point of this partnership that can be created. We believe that once you have a supplier that could meet your expectations as a customer, that is evolving with you, there may be indicators that could be determined since the beginning of the process or during the process. And if those indicators are met, it could be reduction of cost, performance. The idea is to have a mix of indicators. Then this partnership would be extended and maintained. We have some customers that work like that with us. That way, there is an intention, and customers will or suppliers will be willing to invest to keep that partnership in the long run. Also investing in tools. So these tools could be shared. But the main thing here is the spirit of building things together. This is improving in Brazil. We see some initiatives in that line, but the prevailing model is still of a distance, keeping some distance. I believe that some companies have more, their values are more similar, so there's more likely that they will have success in working together to build long-term partnerships. I hope I have answered your question. Good morning, my name is Andreas. I work for Bosch in Brazil. I would like to share with you something. I'm working on the replacement of automotive parts, and we are in spare parts, and we have a distribution centers that has 100% transparency real time of what's going on inside the distribution center. We've started using RFID sensors some years ago to create this transparency. And today we have 100% transparency. What we have reached is with tripled productivity, with a reduction of losses. We have 99.99% accuracy in inventory and no longer customer complaints. This is already possible, and depending on your case, on the tools you use to create this transparency, that depends on your application. Either RFID sensors or camera monitoring, all of that is possible to create transparency. That means 4.0 industry, meaning that you will have data available to everyone in the company. If you want, I could share with you, and you're welcome to visit our distribution center in Campinas.
More examples like that, so obviously not the question, but another great example, so please do take the gentleman up on the offer and network after that. Any other questions from the audience right now? Sorry, did I see a hand in the middle there? No, okay. Maybe a last one from my side to Marcelo, because we're talking so much about asset management and sort of amortization and all the ways that we can account for this. I mean, in Brazil, when we talk about adapting to these technologies more quickly, I mean, is it just that much more difficult to invest in them anyway because of high taxes and interest rates and all the complexities that come into it? So, I mean, is Brazil at a more significant risk of sort of falling a bit behind in some of these technologies simply because of the complexities around asset management?
O que eu tenho visto e a gente tem tido alguma
Seen, and we have had some experience in this matter. There are some credit lines specific to invest in this type of solution. Obviously, it has to be some innovating solution. That one that I talked about, the RPA, is one that we have been quite successful in partnership with the client to find financing for through innovation. This was for the electric sector. We managed to create a series of robots with a partnership with USP, which is the University of São Paulo. And there's ways of using other forms of financing. Muito bem.
Sorry, I have some interference there. Are there any last questions from the audience? Well, on that note, I want to just thank the panel again, but also thank our audience members for all the great questions and to really let this discussion take off. I thought it was really fascinating, so thank you all. We are going to serve, there's a buffet outside, so lunch is served outside where the coffee is. You can eat it standing, you can bring it back here and eat it sitting down. Our next session, we're going to be breaking up into think tank groups. So when we kick it off, we'll introduce you to the different tables. There's going to be about 5 different subject areas. You'll be able to choose which one you want to go to. There's a moderator for each. I'll explain it more in the next session, but just as a little preview, that's what's coming in our next session. So please enjoy lunch, and we'll start off again at 2.